Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to Philosophy for Theology, where we present the marriage of faith and reason through various interviews, counsel, and natural theology and philosophy. And today we have Tom Sarrouf here for an interview. So Tom Sarrouf is originally from Worcester, Massachusetts, and I think I got that right, and he's the debates manager at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, as well as the podcast production manager of Conservative Conversations with ISI. And me and Tom go way back to Boston College, where he graduated just a year before me, but we were friends there. And so very excited to have him on to talk about Catholic social teaching and politics and religion and this sort of thing. So, Tom, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you, Max. It's a pleasure to be on. And you even said my hometown correctly, as we locals say it, Worcester. I don't really have that accent, but you got the nuances right. It's awesome. Yeah, great to be with you again. We spent many years running around Boston College, not really causing any trouble, maybe the good kind of trouble, asking the dangerous questions, and having a lot of fun and prayer and time spent in our dorms and hanging out. So yeah, great to be with you. I'm very pleased and blessed that you would consider me an expert on any topic enough to talk about it. But yeah, what do you got for me, Max?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. No, I enjoyed those days, and thanks again for being on. So I guess we'll jump into it. So could you tell us a little bit about Catholic social teaching, and what its history is, and also its principles and goals?
That's a great question. Catholic social teaching is, I think I describe it as a framework for how Catholics can and should think about political life, social life, and economics, particularly in the modern world. So the teaching comes about starting in like the 19th century, but of course it draws on the entire theological and philosophical tradition of the church. But it's not really until modernity hits, where you have issues like modernism, sort of the idea that we are moving beyond Christianity, the medieval world, and Christendom is over. And so we're sort of celebrating enlightenment, man's reason. It's almost a reversion to paganism. And that's accelerated, I think, over the last 200, 300 years. Same thing with political and philosophical liberalism, sort of lowercase L liberalism. And then particularly within the economic sphere, I think industrialism and industrial capital economy as the basis for economic life throughout the world and throughout particularly, I think, Christendom, or what had been Christendom, so Europe and then obviously in America. These are various upheavals against what had been prior as a Christian civilization. And so they offer a philosophical challenge, but also massively disrupted this sort of remnant. And really in the 19th century, it's not a remnant at all. It's still very much a live thing. You have the papal states, Christianity, and particularly Catholicism still enjoys pretty massive widespread influence in political life and in the moral imagination of Christians throughout the world, which I think is less so in 2024, but there is this sort of rising challenge that's coming about starting in the 19th century. And so it's not like a course. There's not a syllabus. Well, there is a syllabus. It's called the Syllabus of Errors. It's one of these first documents that maybe sets the mark for the beginning of a Catholic social teaching that's responding to these challenges. But it's not a sort of coherent, syllabus where it's, you're reading this thing and that thing and that thing, and it's a coherent course. It's historically speaking, it's ad hoc. It's responding to specific challenges throughout different points. I think one of the big things is the challenge of Marxism and its atheistic materialist worldview, that is offered as a striking contrast against Christian anthropology, Christian political principles, Christian theology. And obviously Marxism has a large role throughout Western history in the 19th and 20th century. So a lot of the encyclicals will talk, lurking in the background, either implicitly or explicitly, is the challenge of communism and communist countries. And of course, John Paul II, who's one of the maybe perhaps main writers of a lot of the documents and encyclicals that are written and promulgated as part of what we call Catholic social teaching, obviously coming from Poland and coming from the communist bloc and then becoming Pope, he has this sort of special understanding and insight into what all of that entails and how the church needs to respond to it. So what you have is a set of problems in Catholic social teaching is a sort of ad hoc set of encyclicals to respond to that and offer Catholics a better understanding and a set of teachings for how to understand the impulses and consequences of some of these modern liberal ideas, not liberal in the sort of political sense, but more in the broad philosophical political tradition that emerges through the Enlightenment, and then how Catholics should respond and engage and live in political life with respect to issues like the family, religion and public life, or church and state, and the economy and human dignity, things of that sort.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, that's really interesting, and yeah, just especially the focus on a lot of these yeah, like false ideologies and this reductionistic. I think that's sort of the what the famous heresy modernism that's going on that various popes like Pope Pius X responds to. That's just a lot of that is reductionism. It's just reducing human person to whatever a means, an economic means, merely something of pleasure or pain. And yeah, no, I think Catholic social teaching, like you're talking about the history there, is trying to respond to that where it sees it has to. So that's really interesting. So yeah, could you talk about, I guess, Catholic social teaching more in the context of more specifically, people today will say there's a strict separation of church and state, and that politics and religion can't or shouldn't mix. There's like this completely stone wall. But what would our American founding fathers say about this? And then again, how would Catholic social teaching respond to this, yeah, kind of separated or delineated, probably too much worldview?
That's a complicated question. So maybe what I'll do is I'll stay general and let you sort of poke and prod where you'd like to and where you think the conversation can lead. But the idea of the wall of separation between church and state, that phrase first comes from Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist Association that was written in 1802. And so he sort of makes this phrase, there is a wall of separation between church and state in America. And that's what, if you're being educated in school about sort of the First Amendment and the Establishment Clause, that is what is commonly pointed to, like in grade school, middle school, high school, college, for how America views church-state relations. But that is one of a very vast literature and set of documents and positions and beliefs about church-state relations in the early republic and the sort of founding era. And I think even that letter, if you read it in context, it's more accurate to say not that religion and politics are strictly separated and should not mix. Jefferson maybe holds that view. I could talk more about that, more about Jefferson's particular views. Not that I'm an expert on any of this, but this is one of the sort of things that animates my own life and interests is, the intersection between faith and politics, and specifically between revelation and reason and religion and politics. But I think it's more accurate to say that he's saying that the church or that the government is not going to interfere with the Danbury Baptists' religious life and their free exercise. That's not to say that it also means that reciprocally, the Danbury Baptists have to keep their religion out of politics or out of their political life. And so if you're looking, I'm going to paint with broad brushstrokes here, but if you're looking at a lot of American history, there is a separation between church and state. It's in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, nor prohibiting or nor restricting the free exercise thereof. So the two religion clauses in the First Amendment, but at the state level, there's nothing like a strict separation. So you have various states who have establishments of religion. Some states like Virginia and Pennsylvania don't. Others like Massachusetts, Connecticut, South Carolina, I believe, and North Carolina, I'm pretty sure in North Carolina, it's actually written in the state constitution, that there will be a state establishment. And then, so that exists from before the Constitution, and then it exists after the Constitution. And then I think by 1835 is Massachusetts is the last state to disestablish or basically remove the state religion. And basically all that really means is there's a church that is given money by the state and is sort of preferred by the state. And so they give various preferences and privileges to that specific church, whether it's like the Puritan church or the Episcopalians or Presbyterian, what have you. So there's not this strict separation. You also have presidents who are giving speeches invoking the name of God in a positive way. George Washington's farewell address. You have various other laws in terms of how education, so school prayer laws, blue laws or Sabbatarian tradition, where businesses are forced to be closed by law on Sunday because it's out of respect for the Sabbath and sort of religious understanding that you need a day of rest. So there are various laws, blasphemy laws, restrictions on speech on the basis of that it might give offense to a religiously motivated understanding of what one can say and what one can't say. So blasphemy laws, which are on the books, very well throughout American history. And then in 1947, there's this case called Everson versus the Board of Education, and it establishes the strict separation, which occurred again at the federal level. There was no Congress there was no federal national church, but there were these various state ones. Then it said that any state level establishment or giving preference to religion is not kosher. You can't have that. And it's done through this thing called the incorporation doctrine. So it was taking the First Amendment, which did not apply to the states, and then through the 14th Amendment was applying them onto state laws and policies. And this is done throughout various different issues, not just sort of First Amendment jurisprudence. And then this later gets built on in the 1960s with a case called Engel v. Vitale, which bans school prayer, even voluntary ecumenical school prayer of any sort. But I don't think this is a revolution in thought. This is not in Everson, the justices used this wall of separation between church and state. But for instance, a scholar by the name of Mark David Hall, who I'm sort of read a fair bit of his work, I really enjoy his work, talks about how this is overemphasizing the role that Jefferson and Madison in particular play, and they're both from Virginia, so they have a large role in the Virginia state establishment and Virginia religious freedom. So for instance, Jefferson writes the bill establishing religious freedom in the state of Virginia. So we're going to say we're going to have no established church. And then they read that into the First Amendment. I don't think that's quite right. That overemphasizes their role, and it even overemphasizes and oversimplifies their views on religion. Because Jefferson, while having this state establishment, having this state prohibition on establishment, this broad religious freedom in the state of Virginia, also had, and this was introduced into the Virginia State Assembly and passed by both houses of the state legislature, a law that would punish breakers of the Sabbath. So if you're working on the Sabbath, you'd have to pay the equivalent of like 10 shillings, I think is what the text of the bill said, for violating the Sabbath. So we're going to have religious freedom, but we're also going to have laws punishing Sabbath breakers. And this was both authored by Thomas Jefferson. So it's more complicated than even just saying he was a deist who wanted no mixture, who wanted this strict separation. I think it's more complicated than that for Jefferson. But even so, it overemphasizes the role that these two Virginia these two founders had in establishing for the entire country what the idea was of non-establishment or religious freedom. But I think when you look more at state laws and how there was a sort of mixture between church and state, that's not a strict wall of separation, you really see that Everson is, I think, at least a mistaken ruling in terms of understanding what things were like at the time of the founding, what our founders believed was necessary as a mixture between church and state or religion and public order needed for politics. I could say more, but I'll yield back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That was really good. Yeah, no, it sounds like, you have this more complicated history than people think. Obviously people don't want a government that's going to like forcibly baptize people or do things against yeah, like stuff like that. But at the same time, we see that, the church being involved and helping out with politics and governance and yeah, just like providing insight and vice versa can lead to yeah, just a lot of situations where people are able to avoid sin better and enter into deeper relationship with God because of what they can do. As St. Paul says, praying at all times, and so it's easier for them in a society that lets them pray at all times. In some sense, and so yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah, I guess like how do you think that kind of bridging that into today? How do you think? Um, well, I guess we can start with what would you say a natural law is? Because I think morality, just like morality, we can know. We talk about this on the channel through reason. How does that relate to good law and governance? And then how do you think that we can practice it better today to make sure that both our civic government and yeah, our religions in America are able to prosper. So
Yeah, natural law is the laws of nature, and what that means is that I'm not necessarily thinking about that in sort of like a Newtonian way of, we have like laws of mechanics, but more like the idea of what is something's nature, what is the thing, and from that thing, how can it fulfill its purpose, or how can it be what it ought to be? This is all from Aristotle. There are various different natural law traditions in sort of classical antiquity with the Greeks, and then it gets incorporated into, as you very well know, with Augustine and the early church fathers. A lot of them adopt this various principles and sort of baptize them within Christian theology. And I think, of course, the sort of the high watermark of this is Thomas Aquinas, who incorporates Aristotle and Plato, or with Augustine and Catholic theology, and sort of brings this entire beautiful natural law tradition into the Catholic Church and really formulates it and formalizes it. But I think Cicero has various, I mean, I guess within classical antiquity and the like Greek philosophy, people are interested in asking, Plato being the first, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and then various Romans and Stoic schools, so the sort of early philosophers that we think of when you take like an intro to philosophy course, and like, 500, 400 BC, they're asking questions of like, what is justice? How do we know, is justice the same everywhere? You have the famous question of, the dead, the Persians eat their dead, and the Greeks find that to be totally obscene and immoral. Is there a basic criterion by which you can judge all mankind? And Cicero says something to the effect of, there's not one law in one place and one time, and it's the same here and different there, but it's the same for all places and all times. And how do you know that? You have to move outside of your own political community. So it's this, the beginning of philosophy is the fracture or the break between the customs of the laws of my people and your people, Max, and we're moving beyond that and looking outside of that to what validates the laws that we have in the United States today. Is it based on something prior? Is it based on principles that are more basic than the particulars that we're talking about, and these sort of broader principles of justice, of morality, that give force to or help us make sense and coherence out of our own legal system? And thinking even beyond politics, it's literally just, what does it mean to be a human being? What is a human being? Okay, well, we're rational and we're social and we're animals. So in order to be what we are, that sort of connotes certain things. In order for us to be happy, as Aristotle says, we have to live the life of virtue. And virtue is just sort of natural law when it comes to applied to human beings. Is if we're going to be virtuous, we have to do certain things, we have to avoid other things, which Aquinas calls the first law of practical reason, is to do good and avoid evil. And that's in a moral sense, but also thinking about what we're doing in our own day-to-day lives and how we're contributing to or detracting from our own ability to flourish or be happy. And that means, how we orient and practice our lives. And as Catholics, the ultimate flourishing is the beatific vision. And so part of flourishing is piety, and that's a condition of justice and rendering to God what is God's, and then in political life, rendering unto Caesar what is to be rendered unto Caesar. So that's, I guess, my poor or long-winded definition of natural law. As for how it exists within political life, natural law is indeterminate by itself, which is to say, the prohibition to murder or the prohibition to do evil is a general category, and then you have to decide what in your particular circumstance is evil. So murder, rape, theft, those are some sort of basic things. They need to be determined or made more particular in the circumstance in which we inhabit. So the natural law needs positive law. And in the same sense, in order for positive law, which is just to say, like, whatever law is written down by lawmakers and put into law and made effective and given the power of force of like the state or of the political authority, you have to have a natural law, or the sort of background understanding for what makes it actually a just law. So like what makes a law a just law is, does it accord with the principles of natural law? In the American experience, there's a very robust tradition of natural law that the founders all understood. One of the reasons for this is that they all had a pretty classical education. They were reading and doing, theology. They had to know years of Greek and Latin. They could read philosophy, theology, politics throughout, a whole Western tradition of, up to 1700 years and beyond, up to when they were living and being educated. So they had an understanding of what freedom is, why sin is a bad thing, why politics and religion actually do go together. They would actually have to, I forget which scholar it was that sort of researched into this, but he showed that, like, in order to matriculate from Harvard and graduate, you had to be able to defend in Latin a bunch of different statements through logical proof. And so you'd have to be able to explain why, how it can be known by reason that there is a God. You can prove a God by reason. So that would go to Aquinas' 5 ways. So all the founders and all the sort of leaders of political and sort of cultural life in America in the early colonies and in the early republic who were educated would actually have to know and have studied this proof and been able to explain that. So it's like, and when you're thinking about, I guess, the mental maps or the sort of ideas that they have in their head, that's one of them, and that's nothing to sneeze at. That's actually very important for understanding how we understand the founders, is like, well, what did they know? What were they studying? But I feel like I've gone a little bit far afield here. I guess all I'll just say in conclusion here is that, like, natural law and positive law need each other. And in America today, we seem to, I think, especially the way that we treat law as a teacher, which law is always a teacher, and it sort of informs our sensibilities as to what is moral and immoral. And that's because historically it's been based on natural law. And so these general moral principles are infused into particular circumstances. And so we know, like, one of the shortcuts is we know it's wrong to kill because it's illegal to kill. But what makes it illegal to kill is it has to be wrong beforehand. So I think people have an intuitive understanding that law forms and shapes our moral understanding. But now we think that law can say whatever it wants, and we are, vox populi, vox dei is whatever we say through democracy is what the law should be. And so what that ultimately means is that we are gods, or we have the force of establishing morality rather than obeying or, discovering and then living up to its precepts of moral law and natural law. This is not true of the founding generation, I think, at all. And there's a whole robust tradition. The people I'd recommend everyone go listen to and read their work is the good folks at the James Wilson Institute. Professor Hadley Arkus is its founder, and his entire career, he was a professor at Amherst College and now is trying to educate lawyers and judges through his fellowships and his various projects at the James Wilson Institute about how natural rights and natural law is so bound up with the Constitution at the founding period, and what that actually means for a constitutional order in America today is if we're living under the Constitution as the founders designed it and as the founders understood, we also have to understand the natural law principles that they were working with. Otherwise, we're going to get jurisprudence all wrong. And arguably in the last 60 years we have, because we've forgotten so much of, and in part we've forgotten, in another part we've particularly neglected on purpose the teachings of natural law that the founders had. And there's a sort of whole revolution in law and politics today. That'd be my final note on that for now.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I'll link James in the James Wilson Institute, I think it was, in the show notes, and let our viewers check that out more, because yeah, it's very important, the kind of false notion of freedom that's found today. But the people who founded our country, who yeah, I mean, I think most people, most Americans, are going to have an appreciation and love for it really goes back to this natural law, virtue theory, practice of the Christian faith. And so, yeah, no, I think that's very helpful. So I'll link that. Yeah, so before I let you go here, maybe if you have any thoughts on how we could better implement and practice virtue theory and the moral law in America today, especially through, yeah, just like what you see as a culture and or in our laws. And then, yeah, after that, feel free to plug any projects or anything you're working on through ISI. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's so hard because for the last 60 years, we've now had a whole society, I think in large part guided by false constitutional principles laid down and established by the Supreme Court, but also a general, institutionally, a general neglect for, and I think now a contempt for Christianity in particular, but in large part religion. We have this wall of separation idea is so strongly held in the minds of any. So this is why there's a whole boogeyman now in American politics of Christian nationalism, which again, I mentioned Mark David Hall earlier on. His latest book is called Who's Afraid of Christian Nationalism? And at ISI, we actually did a podcast, which will be coming out in a couple of weeks, with him on the book. And a lot of it is a smear. And Mark is critical of Christian nationalism as from a prudential and also religious perspective. He thinks it's too much of a blending between church and state, but the idea that it's some scary threat to American democracy and the current state of things, and maybe it is a threat to the current state of things, but that's a function of how far away we've strayed from where we were even 60 or 70 years ago. So the idea that there could be any mixing between religion and politics is very much, I think, in the contemporary American mind, that is very much something that you cannot do. And so the idea of keeping my religion or your religion or anyone else's religion out of politics, almost that we can't bring it into the ballot box. I think there's a lot of cultural pressure to do this, but this is contrary to very much the principles of America, I believe, in my reading of the history and the political understanding that the founders had. Washington's farewell address talks about how religion is an indispensable support to preserving liberty and preserving self-government. And he said, we should be very wary of anyone who would say that those things go apart. And he's thinking of Jefferson as maybe an exceptional case where you can have someone who is smart enough, learned enough, who can understand the principles of morality and do that, quote unquote, without religion, and who can just do that on the basis of natural law reasoning. But for most people, that won't be the case. And you need the shortcuts for religion, and you need people who believe in the principles of morality, who believe in a future state of rewards and punishments, in order for people to keep their word, in order for people to be industrious and not sort of taking advantage of others, honesty. Obviously, the relationship between religion and the family is the domestic church, centrally important to all of civilization, especially if we view the family as the fundamental social unit, and the way that people come to know and learn love, then yeah, without families and without religious support for families, then you're slowly but surely going to have a decay of civilization. So, I mean, the upshot, like the question now is, what do you do? And that's a prudential question in large part. Do we return prayer to public schools? Mark David Hall says no. I might disagree with him as a prudential matter. Like maybe we do need to bring prayer back to public schools. Maybe we do need to bring back a Sabbatarian tradition where people can have the day to go to church, have the day for leisure, which leisure, as Joseph Pieper talks about, is tied to the idea of transcendence or having a feast or a festival, but giving this time and this space for people to not work, get out of the idea of the work state or become, what he calls proletarianization, and we're just sort of slaves to work. The importance of beauty in public life, beauty in the public square, beautiful buildings, beautiful churches. So there are a ton of things we can do. It can't just be a question of law and morality. Institutionally, there has to be, I think, an overhaul in our understanding. I think the law is a part of that, certainly taking off various disadvantages that the law gives towards religion. And I guess I'll say on one thing in terms of natural law, if we say that natural law is the basis of positive law, that means that, say, take the military draft. You say, it is good for you, Max, that you have to go and serve in the military. If you say, as a religious person, I have an exemption to this, or this, this contradicts my conscientious beliefs or the beliefs of my religion. The way we work it out in America today is like we give some sort of carve out sometimes for religious liberty, but that's a religious liberty to basically violate or have an exception to a positive law. But if we say that the natural law informs the positive law, then we're saying that morality is informing the positive law. So how could you have a moral exemption from something that's moral? That's so.
Right.
But in essence, what happens is we have a civilization where we say the law is this, and we're going to give religious people basically an exemption to not follow the law, which is another way of saying we're going to give religious people the exemption to be bigots or to do immoral things because it's their religion. So it's completely incoherent. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the legal sphere, and I think the law will have a role to play in sort of re-educating people, but also we need to be teaching people the principles of natural law, and that's an educational initiative. That's missionary work that the churches need to do, and institutions, educational, political, social, need to do. So there are no easy answers. I don't have any. I've offered maybe a couple examples of things that we could do that people could agree with or disagree with. But I think the big thing would be the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith put out a document about the participation of Catholics in political life, affirming Catholic participation in politics and trying to use Christian civilization, Christian ideas, Christian morality for renewing continually political life in light of our Christian beliefs. So that's something that we have to always do. And the idea that we have to put politics and religion separate, or we have to keep our religion out of the ballot box, but that's something that Catholics everywhere should reject. So I would go read that document, go read the Catholic social teaching, and then try and live it out in the way you vote, the way you live your life, how you spend your money. But those are things that you could do on like an individual level. But as for larger political questions, there's a lot of debate to be had. So go read the tradition and then go and do likewise, I guess.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, that's great, man. And yeah, appreciate it. And thanks for your insights. Thanks for all your time, man. Is there anything if you want to talk about real quick, the podcast you're working on a little bit more? I already mentioned it a little bit, but if you want to talk about it and talk about where people can find it and other exciting projects you or ISI are working on.
Sure. We at ISI, we run this podcast. We do a lot of things. We host over 150 events a year, seminars, debates, campus lectures. ISI.org is our website, so you can check us out there and get in contact with us if you're interested in learning more about the history and politics of American liberty, of the Western political and religious traditions. But as for the podcast in particular, Conservative Conversations with ISI, we interview scholars on books. We interview them about various political thinkers throughout the Western tradition, exciting contemporary topics. And that's Conservative Conversations with ISI. It's released every week on YouTube. It's released every week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, really wherever you get your podcasts. So if you'd come and start listening, that'd be great. We'd appreciate that. And hopefully it's educationally edifying and entertaining for you. And of course, Max, thank you so much for having me. This has been a fun conversation. Hope we can do it again, and hope to see you soon, my friend.
Absolutely. Yeah, me too on both those counts. And yeah, dude, thanks for taking the time. And God bless you. And thank you to our viewers too for tuning in. So have a blessed day.
You too. Thanks, Max. God bless.